As we were marching, marching in the beauty of the day, a million darkened kitchens, 1,000 little loves grey are torched by all the radiance that as soon as sun is closing.
We want to know why those people travelled to Manchester that day, who they were and where they came from. We're now going to hear, not from historians, but from the descendants of those that were actually at the Peterloo Massacre on that fateful Monday.
For paid work, I was a nurse. I'm now retired. I suppose deep down I'm a farmer. My father farmed, and I was brought up on a farm, and I married a farmer the first time round.
I was a complete bookworm from the age of 8 or 9 when I used to read underneath the dining room table. I can't think why, but that was where I read. And I'm a bookworm, I'm a book freak. I'm a nerd or whatever it is for reading.
I've recently been developing properties. I'm coming towards the end of that now, hopefully. Previously, I've done all sorts of things in my life. I've been a lecturer at college, an art lecturer, painting exhibitions, plenty of those, renovated old vehicles and had a wedding car business at one time.
I'm retired. I've been retired, a long time now. My main passion is music, which gets me out a lot.
I had an interesting career, first in textiles. When textiles disappeared, I moved to an advertising agency, and then after the advertising agency, I moved into British Gas, and I wrote the marketing plan to privatise British Gas. We liaised with Rothschilds. They said, let's have sandwiches in the red boardroom, which I thought was rather grand.
Conducting your own family research has never been so popular. It is now possible to trace your ancestors back hundreds of years while sitting in your living room. For most of us, we might find our ancestor on a census record, or we might learn that they served in the Great War. However, the descendants in this film have managed to trace their ancestors back to 1819 and the Peterloo Massacre.
I had 5 ancestors who were present that day, 16th of August 1819 at Peterloo. It was my great-great-great-grandfather, John Stafford, his father, James Stafford, and 2 of John's brothers, William and Samuel, and his sister Mary. They were all present there that day. I found that, in fact, my great-great-great-grandfather was a poet and song composer who'd actually written songs about the events of the day. We decided as a family to have a party to celebrate Peterloo. The idea actually was mooted as just a party to get the Stafford clan back together again. But then, of course, because I found out rather surprisingly about the involvement in Peterloo, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to have a party to celebrate our family's importance on that day.
I first found out about my ancestors in Peterloo after my mother died, which was only 8 years ago. And I found this book by my great aunts. It's called A Family Biography. So I brought it home and started reading it. And there it told me all about John Edward Taylor. And Peterloo is mentioned in the back. There's a description of Peterloo and how he attended and his reaction to it. He was a businessman dealing with cotton and the cotton manufacture in Manchester. His mother had died when he was only 2. His father set up a Lancastrian school. They were Unitarians and believed very strongly in educating the poor, educating everybody.
Well, my connection to Peterloo is that my grandfather 3 back was John Barnish from Rochdale. Yes, that's right. And he was a clockmaker. And he came down with Samuel Bamford from Middleton and many thousand of Rochdalians and Middletonians. And they came down to Peterloo Fields in Manchester to ask to be included, ask Parliament to be included in those who could vote.
According to family legend, my great-great-grandfather, Isaac Entwistle, marched at Peterloo. I have a letter from my uncle explaining what happened, and I've been fascinated ever since. Isaac Entwistle was born around 1803, 1804. The first proper record I've got is of his marriage to Betty Holt, which was in 1830. Now, I've managed to trace them right the way through then, and the whole family through to me.
I've known about Peterloo for a very long time. My grandfather was interested in family history, and he had an engraving of Colonel Ralph Fletcher, one of the Peterloo magistrates, hanging in his dining room. Colonel Ralph is my great-great-grandfather. This is a particular treasure. It's the family tree.
So we've got 1766.
That's
here.
Jacob, yes.
Yeah, that's Jacob. And I can see that we've got Colonel Ralph here.
Yes, yes.
And it says born in 1757 and then married 1805.
Yes.
And he married Jane Grundy.
Jane Grundy. The Fletcher family in Bolton were playing a very major role in Lancashire at that time. The family had a number of major coal mines. Our family pits were known as turkey pits because we gave employees turkeys at Christmas.
John Edward Taylor. He was a moderate reformer. He didn't believe in the really extreme left-wing sort of agitators. He was a businessman, a factory owner, and therefore needed to make money. He talks often of the agony between seeing the poverty of the poor and yet knowing that if they increased wages, the cotton manufacturers couldn't keep going. But he did feel reform was necessary. He had a gang of mates, Potter's planning parlour, who met every week and talked about the state of the country. They were really worried about the French Revolution that had happened and had caused such chaos in France, and they're worried about that spreading to England. They could feel the unrest around the place. And he was writing for local papers on these subjects.
I was amazed to hear about Isaac's story from my mother. The first time that she mentioned it to me was actually when I came to Manchester to go to university to study politics. My mum said, well, there was a Peterloo in Manchester. It was a massacre, and your great-great-grandfather marched there, Isaac. And I thought, oh, it was nothing. It wasn't, never heard of it.
Anyone looking to trace their family back to 1819 will know how difficult it can be. This is because we are largely reliant on parish records, as it was the time before civil registration and the census. However, because of Colonel Ralph's status and his role as a magistrate, we are able to confirm that he was at Peterloo.
It's very confusing, you see. Some people say he was there and some say he wasn't. The family history is that Colonel Ralph himself was not present at Peterloo. My cousins produced a newspaper, I think it was the Manchester Chronicle, which included an apology from Colonel Ralph. He said how very sorry he was with the tragic events of Peterloo, but he himself was confined to his house in Bolton with sciatica.
I came to St Maxtinius at least 15 years ago. I found Isaac's burial record, I found his wife Betty, and I found a couple of the children. From what I found on the old maps, and then I came up here and walked around Affordsight and Harwood and that area, it was pretty remote. I mean, there's still parts that are pretty remote now and pretty wild.
So we've just arrived in Affordsight, which is the home of the Entwistles. We're all very excited. Trisha and Dan are here, and we're just trying to find where Trisha's great-grandfather lived. We know that it's somewhere around here, but we're not quite sure where. So Trisha, can you just explain where we are now?
We're in Affordsight. This is the Roman road that goes through Watling Street. And I think over there is Yeoman's Farm. Isaac Entwistle lived there with his family on the 1851 census. 1841 census had him at Lydia's, which was a little bit further this way, I think. Weavers, well, they probably didn't earn very much. I don't think the agriculture was particularly good either. So they would have to be pretty well self-sufficient.
So we've just stepped in off the main road, and we think that this is where your great-great-grandfather, Isaac Entwistle, who walked to Peterloo, we think this is where he lived?
Yes, that's right. This is Yeoman's Farm. And as you can see, there's 2 doors there. There were 2 families here, according to the census. Isaac with 6 children, probably in that tiny cottage on the end, which really is tiny.
That is probably most likely because on one of the census he's recorded as an agricultural labourer. We know that with agricultural labourers often the house came with the job.
Yeah.
But it was a seasonal occupation, so money would have been very tight, which is often why you find that the children are doing different occupations in mills and spinning, just to bring in that extra income, extra revenue into the household.
Looking at the properties, that most of them have been renovated now, but you can even tell from there that they were pretty poor. So I think it was a hard life. It's really amazing to see how they lived and, you know, try and imagine how they lived.
One of the most surprising things I actually found was that the poet and songwriter couldn't in fact read or write. He'd never had the opportunity to learn to do those things. And yet he who was in 1840 having a book of his works published, 13 full songs, which were very, very politically motivated and socially motivated. The man was obviously very intelligent.
Keith, this is the biggest family tree I've ever seen in my life.
I usually have a document that's probably 50% of the size that I work on continuously, making notes, scribbling notes, and then occasionally, periodically, I'm going to have to update that, and this is the latest update.
This must have took some serious research.
Oh yes, serious research for a long period of time, about 40 years all in all. Literally when I began I knew nothing about the family history.
Right.
So I just thought, well, if I make a note of all the Staffords and all the facts and details, eventually they will fit into the tree somewhere along the line, which is basically what's happened.
Do you want to just go through your Peterloo ancestors with me?
Of course.
Yeah.
James Stafford was the first Stafford in Ashton, actually. He came over from Castleton in Derbyshire. His son, John Agdon Stafford, was in his late 20s, I think about 28, something like that, when he took the road down to Peterloo. But his 2 brothers, William and Samuel over here, were quite young, 19 and 21 years old.
Now, I can see that you've got this newspaper article, and John Stafford, and he went alias Jack Stafford, the Charleston poet. Have you got any of his poetry?
Yes, indeed. There's one book survives in Ashton, a reference section of their local studies library. Songs Comic and Sentimental, composed by John Stafford, the Charlestown poet, and it contains 13 of his works, 13 of his songs.
And there's a Peterloo song in here.
There is indeed. Peterloo is there.
Wow.
And he literally kept these songs in his head. Peterloo is written in standard English.
Yeah.
Whereas he actually wrote another song concerning Peterloo, which is written in the vernacular. It's written in the slang of the very, very, very difficult to read.
Right.
But the thing from my family's point of view, it's an amazing document because it actually recounts what those 4 people and the sister Mary did on that day in 1819.
I've always been interested in the history of breeds and how they develop. They're called Portland sheep, and they originated on the Isle of Portland. It's the last year's lambs, and the bigger boys are older. I enjoy my sheep. It gets me up in the morning and gets me out there. I don't name the ewes of my sheep. We name the rams when they're going to be sold for breeding. We use aircraft, Lincolnshire aircraft really. Lincolnshire is Bomber County, so I have rams called Tornado, and they're not too big. They're very pretty and they taste good.
My dad gave me a clarinet when I was 7, so I played clarinet in a couple of groups, a concert band and also a West Gallery group, which ties in nicely with Isaac because he would have known that sort of music that we play.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that makes it all the more interesting for me.
Hello, everyone, welcome to the meeting of the Stafford clan. At the party tonight, all my cousins, virtually all of them are going to be there, and their children, and some close friends too. We're obviously going to have a nice buffet and a few drinks, a few sherbets. And we're going to get a young lady, her name is Saskia Janicki. She's going to sing 2 of John Stafford's original songs that were written around about the time of Peterloo.
At the time of Peterloo, unemployment was impacted further by soldiers returning from the Napoleonic Wars and Irish immigration. High taxation on food and provisions, the introduction of mechanisation and cheap child labour left many workers in a state of starvation. In 1819, the people of Manchester and the surrounding districts had no vote. In a bid to boost support for reform, meetings were held across the northwest, including Stockport and Macclesfield. The aim of the meetings was to consider the propriety of adopting the most legal and effectual means of obtaining reform of the Commons House of Parliament.
The period before Peterloo put immense burdens on the magistrates as a body. In those days, of course, there was no police force. Law and order was the responsibility of the county magistrates. Colonel Rafe was one of these county magistrates. Mass meetings were illegal, and we have a notice publicised around Manchester a few days before the date of the massacre.
This is a poster for the meeting.
Yes.
Or should I say against the meeting?
Against the meeting. Yes.
And these would have been all over Manchester.
Correct.
And what is fascinating about this is, obviously this is a modern day card, but your ancestor is one of the magistrates that has signed this poster, hasn't he?
Yes.
Urging people not to take part in this.
Yes. Rafe Fletcher had taken the King's shilling. He said, I'm prepared to be a local magistrate. And from then on, it was his job, in the absence of anything equivalent to a police force, to effect law and order. How could they adhere to their commission to keep the peace if literally thousands of people were breaking the law?
They felt that in their government they should be recognised and supported. There was a sense of injury and pain. They felt betrayed, I think, and persecuted. They were put out of business by factories, with the machines doing the weaving. So it was a desperate attempt by people who were threatened by new machineries and new discoveries, challenged, neglected. There was a sense of outrage.
The first people to arrive were the magistrates, who took up their position in a house on Mount Street with full view of St. Peter's Field. From 11 a.m, men, women and children began to gather, who had travelled on foot from as far afield as Wigan and Stockport. At around 1:20 p.m, whilst Henry Hunt was delivering his speech, the magistrates, concerned by the large crowds, called for military assistance to arrest him. They claim the Riot Act was read, although no one other than the magistrates seemed to have heard it. By 1:30 p.m, the yeomanry have entered the field and are on their way to arrest Henry Hunt. In the process, a 2-year-old boy called William Fildes is knocked from his mother's arms and tragically killed.
The territorial cavalry, the yeomanry, were Manchester shopkeepers and middle professionals, I suppose. They were wealthy enough to have a horse, and it was they who rode into the crowd with their sabres slashing down at full canter and gallop and slaughtered a lot of the people.
In a state of fear and panic, the crowd begins to flee, only to be blocked by the military who'd been given the order to clear the field.
William and Samuel, they were young men, 19, 21 years old, probably got there very early, were keen, and were actually at the front at the hustings by all accounts. And they, of course, were injured when the cavalrymen and the yeomanry tried to arrest Hunt. They were stood in their way. Samuel actually had his thumb cut off, according to Robert Poole. William was crushed and trodden down by the horses, so he was substantially injured, yes.
I think the colonel of the Dragoon Guards did not want to be seen to charge the civilian population of his own country. And they did do the same things as the territorials in front of them, but not nearly as violently, and the crowd always remembered that the dragoons had been much more restrained. Samuel Bamford says that when the 2 charges went in, it was all over in 10 minutes, while 60,000 people fled for their lives in 10 minutes. It must have been unendurable.
Following the events of Peterloo, the government introduced the 6 Acts in an attempt to stop public meetings. In the long term, Peterloo was influential in helping to change public opinion about extending the vote. It also led to the creation of the Manchester Guardian newspaper, now known as The Guardian, and helped shine a light on the plight of working people.
I have several accounts of what he thought of Peterloo and what he did about it afterwards. He went home straight after the event, furious and distraught, and immediately wrote a piece and sent it off to the Times. John Tyas of the Times had been arrested, and he was really anxious that London should know about this, that the news should get out beyond Manchester and the surrounding towns. He later that year wrote a really long piece called Notes and Observations, which he sent to Parliament because he was so radicalised by the event. In this, he rebuts all the excuses and the reasonings that have been given to excuse the magistrates and the yeomanry. And I think he changed a lot of opinion through this long piece of work.
Peterloo was the tip of the iceberg. There's always a balance to be taken between public order and pressure from the public for change in the political scene. And I'm very conscious that public disorder can be disastrous. And this was very much in the background of the magistrates here in Manchester.
And what they were saying in 1819 is, here we are, increasingly wealthy, skilled, socially upward mobile, and we must be included in government too. Out of our own efforts, we make our own money. We don't have it inherited or granted to us by landowners. This is a new, rising, dynamic middle and upper professional classes.
Riots are harmful for everyone. So, although the old political system was very clearly out of date, there was a need for change. But I like to think personally that my family, by working for stability, paved the way for the next generation with Robert Peel in 1832 and the Great Reform Bill and the many changes that followed.
He and his friends, the planning parlour, continued to meet, and 2 years later they decided that what Manchester needed was a national newspaper, but printed in Manchester, and they set up the Manchester Guardian. He put in £50, they all put in 100, so with £1,150 the Guardian was started.
The people we've spoken to have been on quite a journey researching their ancestors. Through Peterloo, they've been able to get a sense of who these people were, and we're keen to learn if they feel a connection to them some 200 years later.
200 years later, after my great-great-great-grandfather, I definitely marched, yes. The core principles of Peterloo, democracy, free speech, that freedom to protest. I mean, they're a key tenet to our modern democracy. I strongly believe that we should have the right to, to congregate and protest and let our voices be heard in a peaceful manner, so that those in power can, really fully understand the will of the people.
My feelings about John Stafford are that he was a remarkable man. For someone to be able to keep in his head all those songs and all those tunes and all the information about the social conditions, political conditions, not only locally, but throughout the country, throughout the world, actually. He must have had an immense capacity to retain information. I really am proud of him. I'm proud of what he tried to achieve and of his, dogged determination, I suppose.
Colonel Fletcher maybe said of him, he was equally loved and hated. He was loved because he stood for the church-going law and order, under which society can flourish. But he was hated, or it could be said he was hated, because he was a very sharp magistrate. If I were to meet Colonel Rafe today, I should feel very much in awe of him. He was a huge achiever and really quite important in local society. I should hold him in awe.
I'm amazed at him. I really am. Marching from Stafford to Manchester must have been a huge walk.
Now, we've been very lucky today with the weather. It is glorious.
Yes.
Can you imagine what it must have been like for Isaac?
Winter must have been pretty bad. I mean, I've been up here in the autumn when it's been raining and it's cold, and Watling Street was awash then.
Yes, it's certainly an exposed spot. We're up on the top of a hill. There's no trees around, so the wind's just going to whip across.
It was wild. The whole place is wild. But you think of Isaac's time, no electricity. Presumably they had wells somewhere on the land. What bit of coal was left, they could probably get off the fields. What else is there? It must have been really bad for them.
I feel very proud of him, of John Edward Taylor. He appears to have been a very principled man. He apparently went round knocking on doors in Manchester, collating lists of people who'd been injured or died, which wasn't really being done by the authorities. They were just trying to cover it up. He does say that he feels a lot of the injuries were committed by a few members of the yeomanry. It wasn't the whole lot by any means. It was, some rogue elements within it. Yeah, I'm very proud of him. Very proud of him.
I'm a Fabian, a rational Fabian. I don't believe in revolutions. I believe in peaceful social reform. So I was delighted to think that I had an ancestor who also believed in peaceful social reform. I was absolutely enchanted to find that my dear great-grandfather Barnish III was asking for the vote in 1819. Good for him.
16th of August, Jem and Jack made a tour to get Manchester meeting to see Mr. Run. We'll be in afternoon before they could start, before they could get leave to go off their work. There's many a one watched them. Oh, but there's few who could catch 'em till they'd gained for miles upon the road. We come to guide the rich and saw something new. A man on horseback riding from Peterloo. He got housestead when he come into seat. We soon found him out, he'd his jacket unread. For it were dyed black and red, an horse tail on his head. I ne'er saw such a monster in our